Hi everyone, my name is Eric Davis and I'm an undergraduate student at Northwestern University. Today I will be briefly covering the key findings of my final project in my GIS Level 1 course. I chose to focus this project on mapping environmental exposure and population vulnerability in New York City. The motivation behind this project draws inspiration from the environmental justice movement. Quoting Robert Bullard, "America is segregated and so is pollution. Race and class still matter and map closely with pollution, unequal protection, and vulnerability." This is, of course, a great concern given that research has shown that exposure to environmental hazards has pronounced health implications on vulnerable populations. Ultimately, this project aimed to test the hypothesis that environmental ills are disproportionately closer in space to vulnerable populations in New York City. In order to address this question, there were key data and methods worth noting. This project's analysis primarily used ArcGIS ArcMap 10.7 and the EPA's Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool dataset. This dataset included environmental and demographic indicators, as well as combined original data from the EPA National Air Toxics Assessment, the U.S. Department of Transportation, as well as the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census Bureau. Although the EPA already has an online environmental justice screening tool that is accessible, publicly available, and open source, it has some distinct limitations that this project attempts to address. For instance, the EJ screen is limited in identifying census tracts with high exposure or index values relative to national or state averages, thus limiting its efficacy at revealing local comparisons and supplying the necessary detail for smaller communities such as cities. Luckily, in 2018, the Natural Resource Defense Council, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting the Earth and its people, partnered with Chicago community organizations to apply the EPA's EJ Screen dataset and reveal local nuance from a novel methodology adopted from the collaboration of academic researchers, community groups, and state agencies in California. The map produced by the NRDC worked to reveal necessary environmental justice concerns in the city of Chicago. Drawing inspiration from the work done in this project, I chose to adopt this methodology, but rather focus my study on New York City. The methodology proposed by the NRDC scores each census block on a scale of 1 to 5, based on the percentiles in which the indicator of interest fell. This operation was applied to 11 environmental indicators to get an overall total. The scoring algorithm was then applied to this total in order to get an overall environmental index. The same was done for 6 demographic indicators. With so many similar styled operations, I chose to use ArcPy and write a Python code to streamline the field calculator process. Altogether, this is the final map of relative environmental exposure and population vulnerability in New York City, as represented by the EJ index. The graph below shows the average environmental justice index by New York City borough. Without a doubt, this map and graph enable viewers to better understand the spatial distribution of environmental justice concerns across the city, as well as highlight areas of concern. With that being said, it takes us back to our original research question, whether vulnerable populations bear a disproportionate share of environmental risks. The Bronx provides a great opportunity to address these questions in a priority area. The Bronx was not only tied for the highest average environmental justice index, it also has a rich history of environmental justice activism. When decomposing the EJ index into individual environmental and demographic indices, we can see the relative distribution across the borough. Luckily, the relatively normal distribution of the environmental index across the Bronx helps to fulfill the necessary assumptions needed to perform statistical hypothesis testing. Our null hypothesis is that there should be no difference between the overall environmental index of the Bronx population compared to the blocks designated as having high relative proportions of vulnerable populations, i.e. when demographic index is equal to 5. Nearly 2/5 of the Bronx census blocks fall within high demographic vulnerability, and so this allows us to pull a large enough random sample. Without going much into the detail of the results, the one sample z-test revealed a statistically significant difference between the environmental risks experienced by vulnerable demographics and the average populations in the Bronx, leading us to reject the null hypothesis and providing initial insight into our original research question. Overall, there are a few key conclusions from this analysis. First and foremost, this project revealed a reproducible method for applying the EPA's available data to better understand the distribution of environmental risks and hazards across local communities. The outputs and maps derived from this project indicate levels of environmental racism and thus necessitate reforms. Of course, this work should not be taken as the ultimate truth. Rather, the screening results could and should be supplemented with additional and local knowledge when working to address specific issues in a particular location. And that concludes my final presentation. Thank you for listening, and if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at ericdavis2021@u.northwestern.edu.